Welcome to Behavior and Risk, where we explore the intersection of decisions, the brain, uncertainty, and the business world. I'm John Burkhart.
And I'm Rich Loria.
We're glad you took a chance on us today. In democratic countries, governments change. It's a certainty, much like death and taxes. At some point, the individuals and parties in power will not be so anymore, and the legal and philosophical foundation of the country will shift. This regime change is normal and a natural part of democratic societies. Sometimes changes in regime are easy to see coming well in advance, and planning for them is relatively easy. But even in stable democracies, sometimes we get surprises. Over the last 3 months, we've had a fascinating array of regime changes around the world. Between November 5th, 2024 and January 15th, 2025, we've seen shifts in the executive in the United States, Canada, Germany, and South Korea. Each of these entailed some level of surprise, and some of them decidedly more so than others. There are some interesting lessons we can take from this. How do populations and corporations respond in the face of regime change? And how should they respond in order to optimally position themselves and mitigate risk? That's what we want to explore today. Rich, we've had a lot of conversations back and forth about this, and I find this absolutely fascinating because there's so much in the way of uncertainty around even a normal election, even something that is scheduled and on the calendar and that we know is coming and candidates have been campaigning. There's still huge amounts of uncertainty that people and businesses need to think about and factor for. And then when we get these unusual, I would call them crazy, some of them are not really crazy. One of them, I think, rather is. There's huge levels of uncertainty that are introduced. And what do companies do? What do people do? How do we manage to deal with all this uncertainty and unlikely or improbable events that are emerging all around us? Are there ways for companies to plan for and respond to regime change like this?
Thank you, John. I would argue that regime change and the uncertainty associated with regime change is a banner posted for why companies should engage in a robust ERM program. I would argue it's an advertisement for the value and the benefits that you can get from it, because a robust ERM program will consider scenarios. We'll consider a variety of possible scenarios that could play out with regards to something like regime change.
And this, I think, in some ways gets back to a conversation you and I have been having for nearly a year now around what is the definition of risk. For those of you who are just joining us or who've not read our book, which hopefully will be fewer and fewer with each passing week, one of the interesting conversations, one of the interesting questions is, how do we define what risk is? I have always liked the definition of anything that might happen. And in the case of regime change, as you're characterizing it here, I feel like that is a very appropriate definition.
I agree and I disagree at the same time, John.
I'd be
So,
disappointed were it otherwise.
yes, in this case, it certainly has an application, but I would then encourage our listeners, and I would encourage everybody to think about what it is that we're concerned about. And where I differ a little bit in terms of the definition is that there has to be something at stake. And in particular, with regime change, what makes it so particularly risky for individuals and businesses is that the regime change may lead to changes in policies and the overall structure of the global economy that can have adverse impacts on individual players, whether it's you and me going to the grocery store or it's businesses trying to compete in a global marketplace.
And that question of what's at stake, I think, has a lot of variation with what countries are we talking about? What are the government structures in place? What are the economies? What are the business environments? And of course, a change in regime, a change in the executive, and depending on the government system, a change in the legislature resulting from a change in the executive can have all manner of different impacts in terms of what is at stake. What are the things that are exposed to change, and what are the elements of uncertainty that are going to manifest within a society or within a country? I'd say let's start with the US election because out of all of these, I think this was the least surprising and easiest to see coming. It was a normally scheduled election. Both candidates were known well in advance, and there was a clear winner almost immediately. The only elements that you could really characterize as surprising or unpredictable were the Democrats' candidate, which, while unorthodox in its determination, wasn't really a huge surprise. And depending on who you ask, the margin of Trump's victory here. But otherwise, this was an unremarkable presidential election, and the institutional response, I think, for the most part, has reflected that. We see some market indicators showing mild exuberance after Trump's victory. S&P 500 gained 5% between November 4th and November 11th, fell off a bit, but as of January 15th, still a mild lift of 3.5%. So the US election, while there's uncertainty in the sense of, oh, there is going to be an election and we don't know who the winner is going to be, hasn't really disrupted things a whole lot.
I would agree with that. I think we've known who the winner was likely going to be, arguably from the debate performance of Joe Biden, the one debate that he did participate in. I'll just speak for myself. I thought the election was over then, even though the Democrats, after doing some hand wringing for a number of weeks, reluctantly set about coercing President Biden to drop out of the race and not continue his reelection bid. All that happened, in my humble opinion, is that they brought in someone else, and the logical candidate was the vice president to do this, to step in and try to do damage control. But in my humble opinion, Kamala Harris, as strong a debater and as excellent an orator as she is, I don't think she was ever going to be in a position where she could separate herself enough from the administration to convince public sentiment to generate votes her way. So she lost the independent vote significantly. She lost every swing state. And in retrospect, it really wasn't surprising. I think in some ways, I personally was surprised that the polls were that close.
So it's interesting that you say that this was unsurprising to you, that you saw this coming fairly far in advance, a few months in advance at least, especially when we look at those market indicators where the stock market, the S&P 500, investors, both retail and institutional, have shown positivity around this election. And I find this really interesting because historically, the market doesn't like elections. The market does not get happy when things are different. The market doesn't like change. The market likes to know what's happening, and they like to have a continuity of whatever's happening. Now, we know there's going to be a huge shift in the direction of government, or at least we assume there's going to be a huge shift in the direction of government between the Biden and Trump administrations. But nevertheless, we do see this mild positivity occurring in the aftermath of the election. And I wonder if that's because of the foreseeability of this, the fact that this really wasn't a surprise, that people by and large did see this coming.
No, I mean, I will say this. I'm certainly not alone in my views, but by no means did I go out and wager a fortune on this. And by the way, there are plenty of places now with legalized gambling where you can go and bet on elections. If I really had the power of my convictions, I would have put those bets in quite a while ago. So, John, you're absolutely right. The markets reacted to the change in a possible outcome and probably the more likely outcome to one that became certain. And that's what was reflected in the markets. And the positive sentiment of Trump coming back into power in terms of less regulation, America First policies, and a focus on supporting businesses through enhanced initiatives, reducing things such as environmental type of regulations, and generally bringing us back to, I think many voters and I think many in the business community are hoping that there is a return to the pre-pandemic economic situation. I think that's what a lot of folks are pointing to, and that's what a lot of investors are pointing to in terms of the hope.
There's an interesting element, I think, to any sort of risk response or planning because you're essentially trying to foresee the future. When people are looking at the election and they have their sense of how it's going to play out, they're making a forecast, they're making a prediction. And one of the things that we know from decades of data is that people, by and large, are inappropriately overconfident in their own predictions, that they are far more certain about things than they probably should be. So the question I pose to you then is, given that we know people tend to be overly confident about judgments that they make, and that their judgments are often influenced heavily by what they want to believe, by their confirmation bias,
Mhm.
Have you seen any organizations that have really gotten things wrong in terms of either their own prediction or their response in the aftermath of the election?
What we are now seeing is some moderation of the initial enthusiasm around the Trump election, because the reality is that the fundamentals of the US economy have not materially changed, at least not yet. And there are the challenges of trying to undo what the previous regime had done for the previous 4 years. So there's some recognition of that going on. And I'll just bring up one example of an industry that is starting to look at things a little bit differently than they did on election night, and that's the banking industry.
Hmm.
The banking industry was euphoric. Even some of the CEOs like Jamie Dimon, who were critical of Trump, were actually in some ways rather pleased because, in large part, that there was a view that some of the regulations currently on tap, those regulations coming in the aftermath of our previous podcast, the SVB
Hmm.
meltdown, that these regulations, which were put under the banner of Basel Endgame, right? The Basel Endgame, which I love because it sounds like something out of the Avengers. Um, and somehow Thanos was going to come down and make all these capital requirements and make life miserable for the largest banks. Anyhow, the general feeling was that for banking executives was not only was that Basel Endgame probably going to get squashed, but that some of the existing regulations around Dodd-Frank would be rolled back even further, much as they were back in 2018, 2019 during the first Trump administration. There was a lot of belief around that, but now it appears that there has been more of a tempering of that, and that there's still going to be a Basel endgame, but there's still hope that it will not be as capital punitive. The initial pronouncements coming out of the OCC and the Fed when Basel Endgame was first introduced, was first floated out there by the leadership, was that it was going to wind up being something like a 10 to 20% increase in capital requirements, particularly for the largest banks. And that's what the banks have been railing against, understandably. And so the feeling was when Trump won the election, got back into power again, that that was dead in the water. However, from conversations I've been having with colleagues at Columbia who are in the industry, it appears there's going to be some type of Basel endgame. But their hope is that it will be closer to capital neutral. That is the general hope. But that's very different than a full rollback of other aspects of Dodd-Frank, including possibly even reduced capital requirement. That's not going to happen, at least not in the short run anyway.
And I think that illustrates something that is really important to keep in mind for anybody who's putting together a forecast prediction, a risk response model, or modeling out various contingencies for the future, which is that your forecast is always going to be heavily influenced by your own self-interest and your own confirmation bias. The banking industry, the senior executives wanted to see this Basel endgame go away and therefore were far more inclined to believe that it was going to and act according to that. And I think that, seeing Trump being elected fuels that confirmation bias. You can pick whatever data points you want from that and say, see, this assumption, this expectation is warranted. And so I think that this is a common failing of a lot of forecasting and developing responses to potential changes in regime.
That's absolutely on point, John. And that gets back to optimism bias and the mix between optimism and overconfidence. Executives, by their nature, leadership by its nature, are expected to project optimism to the employee ranks and to their leadership teams, because that motivates folks to go forward and implement the various strategic initiatives that are going on around the company. So even when there is uncertainty, there is, to your point, confidence bordering on overconfidence, as well as just general optimism that, hey, we are who we are. We've been a successful company for X number of years. We're going to figure out how to do this one way or another. And sometimes that leads to a belief that certain things can be implemented that turn out to not be able to be implemented when the rubber hits the road.
I want to shift gears and move on to what I see as the next most uncertain or next most ambiguous regime change that we've seen, which was Canada's Justin Trudeau stepping down from his position as prime minister recently. To US observers, this was a huge surprise. But if you talk to Canadians, it's not really as unexpected as we might think. At the time he stepped down, Trudeau was hugely unpopular. He had a 16% approval rating on the day that he made his announcement. And federal elections in Canada are happening in the fall of 2025 anyway. You can make a pretty compelling case that this was a very canny maneuver by Trudeau to best position the Liberal Party for the new round of elections. Now, market indicators here have supported this notion that despite the surprise in the States and other parts south of Canada, Canadian people and business interests were really unperturbed by this. The Toronto Stock Exchange was essentially unchanged, and likewise, the Canadian dollar didn't meaningfully move against the US dollar in any way. It seems that here the news was already priced into the markets. So then how do we interpret this, where you have an unexpected announcement, an unexpected stepping down of a prime minister, and in a really interesting bit of political maneuvering, Trudeau did something called proroguing Parliament, essentially sending Parliament home until middle of March, so nothing will happen in terms of the legislature or the executive for several months. And among Canadians, it largely seems to be business as usual. So how do we explain that?
Well, I think it comes down to, in the long run, in my mind, what is going on in Canada at this point is one of timing. And the fact that if you look out a year down the road or thereabouts, there was going to be a different government. It was most likely going to be a conservative government. It's clearly trending that way.
Yeah.
So that calculus has not materially changed. What has changed is how we're getting to that place, how we're getting to that particular regime change. I don't think anybody in Canada was particularly bothered about Trudeau stepping down, but it was still a surprise, and the markets, at least initially, reacted as such. And in fact, consumer sentiment in Canada is at lows that are worse than the pandemic, if you can believe that. And that is something that Canada has in common with another country we're going to talk about in this podcast, Korea. But I think what's going on in this situation is there is the perception now of a leadership vacuum. And who is going to be dealing with the Trump administration, particularly with Trump's pronouncements of 25% tariffs on all goods imported from Canada? Who's going to be able to push back or be able to negotiate for something that's not as punitive to Canada's economy, at least as it currently sits? So I think it's how we're getting to that place that has folks unnerved.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. I think there's less surprise or uncertainty in this case than you might guess at first glance. I think that there's a huge amount of, let's call it wish fulfillment, which you could say is analogous to a prediction satisfaction in the electorate and in many Canadian businesses where they've been complaining about Trudeau for varying amounts of time, and now they're getting what they asked for. So there's not a huge really amount of uncertainty here. Some. It is a bit of a surprise, but it's really, I see most of the variability occurring here in the time dimension. Rich, you and I were talking about that
Mhm.
beforehand, that businesses, individuals to a lesser extent, but organizations, they have their plans. When you have scheduled elections that you know are coming, you build transition plans, or at least you should. If you're running an organization and you're not developing transition plans for regime change, you really should probably not have your job, or at the bare minimum, should hire a very good CRO. The transition has been known, and the optics have all said that the Liberals are probably going to be out. So this is not a surprise. But the time domain, the fact that the background is not what you necessarily assumed it was going to be, and the speed at which you will have to implement your transition plan is now going to be very different. You don't have nearly as much runway as you might have had leading into it. Now, depending on where you sit, depending on what your organization is, what your available resources are, this might not be a huge deal. But if you're a juggernaut like BMO or some other comparably large and entrenched Canadian organization, having to adjust your timeline is a huge problem.
Yeah, and I think one of the sectors that probably the sector that's been most impacted is the energy sector, and there are clear winners and losers. So what we've seen in the market data is oil and gas stocks have benefited greatly from this. Even though there probably won't be any material changes in policy, at least here in the short run, because again, I think there's going to be a no confidence vote once the parliament does come back. And I don't really see anything getting done in Ottawa probably until after the election, anything material. But yet, it's interesting. The market has already now, because of this triggering event, said, aha, you see, here an anti-oil and gas leader has stepped down. So this has to be good. It has to be good. And conversely, if you are a company that has focused on clean energy policies and so forth and have been building out that capability, you've taken a hit.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting the point that you raised where you see this exuberance around energy, gas, forestry, these traditional
Yeah.
resource intensive industries that historically are really the backbone of the Canadian economy. There's been a major shift in recent years, but going back for decades, that's been what fueled Canadians' rise to economic prominence. And we are seeing these influxes of wealth and investment into them, despite the fact that while Trudeau has stepped down, the Liberals are still the majority in Parliament. That's not exactly true. It's a minority majority. A Canadian friend of mine tried to walk me through it, and I will not pretend to fully understand the Canadian Parliament. Therefore, I'm not going to say anything that would get me in trouble. But Liberals still hold the reins for the moment. And policy around these industries is not changing. And nevertheless, we do see money flowing into them. And I think this, again, comes back to time domain and prediction error and elements of reinforcement. I think this is opportunistic. People are predicting that things will go well, that there will be a freeing of the reins on these industries in the fall. And so they want to buy in now when prices are cheap. And this, of course, fuels itself. This causes the share price to rise, and then people see, oh, it is going up, and you get a feed forward cascade. I think it's also an element of, we've talked about, Rich, you and I, this element of being able to create reinforcement in your brain to something that you imagine happening. If you imagine something positive happening in the future, your brain can create a dopamine signal in response to that. So for people who are bullish on these particular industries, these particular sectors, I think they're probably reinforcing themselves. They can imagine this happening already, even though it's easily months in the offing. But they are feeling that dopamine bump, and dopamine tells your brain, let's do more of whatever we just did. So in this case, getting excited about these industries. Now, the interesting question will be, what happens if this doesn't play out the way that they're expecting? To your point around Trump, there was kind of the implicit assumption before he was fully elected that Trump in his second term would be a full continuation of term one and potentially even more of what he already had been. And now we're seeing the audibles are suggesting that's not exactly going to be the case. It might be a little more moderate than people were thinking. So then what happens to these people who are creating predictions for themselves, for their organizations, if they don't fully come true? And my prediction here, and I realize I'm making a prediction about people making predictions, which is rather meta. My prediction here is if you don't see something akin to a full matching of the expectation in fall, if there's not a full freeing of these industries, we're going to see a contraction. We're going to see a withdrawal of capital. We're going to see a flight from investment. Even if there is some loosening of the reins, if we don't see a full loosening of the reins, people are not going to feel as though their prediction has come true. And this will be an aversive event.
Yes, John, we could see a similar pulling back once the newly elected conservative government is in place. And if, God forbid, the liberals do manage to retain power, there is a non-zero probability that they could.
Sure.
It's going to be very interesting to see what happens to the stock values of those particular companies. But yeah, I think there's a certain amount of groupthink that's gone into this because
There always
um,
is.
there's a feed forward effect and a narrative that's out there. It's in the domain. It's impossible to Google impact of Trudeau resignation on Canada economy and not find articles on how it's going to benefit the natural resource industries in Canada. So it's been in that domain for a while. It's almost like a lot of the editors of business publications were waiting for this to happen in order to be able to put that out.
And I think the lesson here is when a regime change comes to fruition, when it becomes clear who the winner in a race is, dial back your predictions, dial back your expectations. Even if you have a sense directionally where things are going to go, dial back your assumptions of magnitude because, again, we come back to self-interest and overexuberance and overconfidence. Things are probably not going to manifest as wholly or completely as you assume they are. We know that we're going to impose some level of desire and self-interest on our predictions, on our models, on our forecasts, on our transition plans. So don't do that.
So before we leave the Canadian situation, which is an evolving situation and a rather stable one, despite some of the tumultuous change that has happened here in the recent weeks, one other industry that's worth mentioning beyond the natural resources is cryptocurrency. The Trudeau administration, the Trudeau regime has largely been hostile towards crypto in terms of its regulation and certainly what's happened with FTX and Terra Luna and so forth has not helped that and gave the Trudeau-led regime some ammunition to provide some more shackles around the digital currency space. But there is now a belief among executives that with regime change on the horizon, already beginning to take place in Canada, that there could be a rolling back of some of the policies that the Trudeau regime been putting into place, and that those changes could be quite favorable for the crypto industry, and it could be seen as a far more accepted form of exchange in Canada. One other point before we leave this topic is that the leading candidate from the conservative wing for Canada is a big fan of crypto and has come out on record of wanting to make crypto a more accepted medium of exchange in the country. So there's definitely reason for some optimism among fans of cryptocurrency.
Which is interesting because, in my experience, fans of cryptocurrency are always optimistic. It is one of the greatest sources of energy in the universe is cryptocurrency optimism. If one could harness that, we would have clean energy for now until the heat death of the universe.
And world peace. Yeah.
Exactly. Let's move on to Germany because now we're starting to get into some things that were really, I would say, genuinely unpredictable that caught people off guard. Germany was an interesting situation. To external observers, it would seem that the ruling coalition spontaneously collapsed on November 6, 2024. However, the coalition had been unstable from the start. One of the coalition members, the Free Democrats, was never really a natural fit with the Social Democrats and the Greens. Initially, it seemed that Chancellor Olaf Scholz of the Social Democrats precipitated the whole thing by dismissing a Free Democrat member from his cabinet, but subsequent reports have come out showing that the Free Democrats had actually planned to all exit the coalition en masse. Scholz caught word of the plan, however, and preempted their D-Day to basically take control of the narrative. So the collapse was known in advance by the Social Democrats. To the populace, however, and to German businesses, the exact architecture of the collapse is immaterial. And while the instability of the coalition was known well ahead of time, that it would collapse was not. Now, in response to all of this, the DAX, the German stock market, showed a slight dip in response to the December 16th no confidence vote in Scholz, bottoming out on December 23rd, but it began rebounding on January 6th and was back to pre-collapse levels by January 7th of this year, which shows a few different things. One is that people have very short memories, especially when you have things like a holiday season in the middle where you have Christmas and then the New Year, and you're probably not thinking a whole lot about anything except your family and baked goods. And two, I would argue, because this was a more surprising scenario, and it's very unclear in terms of who is going to emerge in the subsequent election. My wife is German, and I overhear a lot of conversations with her and her family, and nobody knows who they want to vote for. It's a very murky situation. I would argue we're seeing a lot of what we call status quo effects, that nobody is sure what the right choice is. Nobody's really even sure what the options are. And because they don't know what the right choice is, they're just not really doing anything in terms of business positions, in terms of personal investment, in terms of market movements and what have you. And when we get into some subsequent conversation, I think we see this pattern echoing and repeating in lots of different regime change examples.
Yeah, so I think what's going on, in addition to status quo bias, I think there's just general risk aversion. So, look, the German economy has contracted for 2 consecutive years. So, what's been going on in the market, the fact that the market reaction has been relatively muted is more a reflection of just the general overall malaise of the German economy and a lot of the underlying uncertainty that was there even before the regime change. So I would argue in this case, the regime change, while important, was in some way, shape, or form already being factored in by the markets. And the real issue now for businesses and consumers in Germany is this underlying uncertainty, which is going to result in pullbacks from doing anything extensive. Because there's a general level of risk aversion, no one wants to take a risk because you don't know what the next ruling coalition is going to look like. It's hard to see the German economy able to rebound back. There's just so much uncertainty about what's going to happen. And therefore, things are just going to kind of continue to putter along, which isn't particularly good news for the economy.
It's not good news for the economy, but it's funny. I think it's potentially good news in terms of business positioning. When we talk in the class about black swans and how should companies respond to black swans, we often talk about how there is a tendency to don't just stand there, do something, respond in some way, no matter what, even if you aren't sure what the new baseline is anymore. And what I have advocated for many years now is that you are better served by taking a week or two to verify and understand what the new baseline looks like before implementing a business positioning and a new set of organizational policies than by going ready, fire, aim and moving full speed ahead without a full understanding of the circumstances. I think that in this case, the status quo effect, tendency to avoid making decisions because somebody's unclear of what is correct, and the risk aversion that you spoke to is probably serving businesses quite well. The fact that we don't know what the ruling coalition is going to be, we don't know really what the percentages are going to be or who's going to be the majority within these coalitions, creates an enormously variable baseline that is essentially impossible to predict.
That's interesting, John, because I would argue this is where a robust ERM program can in some ways be most valuable. So in contrast to the US and Canada, where yeah, there's uncertainty, and there's certainly uncertainty in the short run, and there's ongoing adjustments on the fly as the relative political transitions take place. Our argument for investors in those countries and businesses in those countries is to maybe scale back a little bit the general optimism from the regime change that I think many had initially projected. I would argue here this is different in that with the German situation, there's so much uncertainty. It's really critical for the ERM team to work closely with business leaders around an organization to scope out different scenarios. So what happens if this group gets elected, or what happens if this particular leader is chosen? I would argue it's very, very important to bring in folks from government relations, folks who are close to the situation is it Berlin?
Yes, Berlin, the Reichstag is there.
So I would say it's very, very important to have contacts there, interview them, and work through different scenarios of what can play out. And then based on the evaluation of those scenarios, which we know are going to have certain biases in developing the assumptions, but it gives you something to work with in terms of planning. And given where things are in terms of the marketplace, it's actually an opportunity. It could be a very good buying opportunity if one is thinking through this in a good enough manner. And as you say, John, takes the time to work through the different possibilities that can emerge from this.
Yeah, and I think that's to amplify your point. That's a huge part of the importance of ERM, of a really strong and robust ERM program for an organization, because we think about it largely in terms of how do we insulate ourselves from exposure? How do we mitigate against impact when bad things happen? But a good ERM program is going to take into account those opportunities that emerge. Risk can have upside as well. And if you have a framework in place for evaluating what the opportunities are, evaluating what the risks are, you can come out of an unstable or uncertain situation better than when you came into it, which seems to be largely counter to what most thinking around unexpected regime changes is.
Right. Yeah. It's very important to think beyond the boundaries of how we normally define risk. that risk is not necessarily all bad. And again, going back to some of the sayings of Warren Buffett, you want to be greedy when people are fearful, and you want to be fearful when people are greedy. Well, right now, the economic situation in Germany is one of quite a bit of fear, which is reflected in a lot of the status quo bias, is reflected in a lot of the risk aversion that's going on within economic actors in the country. So this is really an opportunity to be able to leverage that situation for one's advantage. But it has to be done with caution. I'm not suggesting going out there and doing massive expansion plans and falling prey to optimism and overconfidence either. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there is an opportunity here if a robust analysis of the potential outcomes and of the potential futures, because this is a very variable baseline situation, but it does lead to the possibility of some good things coming out.
And that uncertainty really plays into the next area I want to talk about, which is, of course, South Korea. South Korea is almost certainly the strangest regime change of the four we have on our plate today, and one of the strangest really of the last several decades. On December 3rd of 2024, South Korean President, I apologize for pronunciation in advance, Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law in response to what he termed anti-state opposition, essentially in response to the legislative majority voting against his agenda. In a bizarre twist, this declaration of martial law only lasted for about 6 hours, was vehemently rejected by the legislature, and immediately resulted in calls for Yoon's impeachment. The legislature ratified the impeachment on December 14th, and then on January 3rd, investigators attempted to take Yoon into custody from the presidential residence, but were blocked by his security forces. On January 15th, they tried again, and this time succeeded, reportedly with the assistance of over 1,000 police officers. So what's next? Well, as of the recording of this episode, no one really knows. We are deep into unprecedented territory here. This, as I mentioned, easily has the most uncertainty around it of all the cases we've discussed. There's clearly going to be a change in leadership, but who comes in, no one really knows. And the circumstances that precipitated it are so bizarre that people must be questioning virtually everything that they think they know. The Korean markets have shown significant drops, with the Kospi and the Kosdaq falling by 6% and 10% respectively between December 3rd and December 9th. However, it's worth pointing out that the Korean market has comparatively little foreign investment, so this is mostly an indicator of domestic uncertainty and unease. The Korean won is very slightly down against the US dollar, but probably less than we would think it should be. And so I think here we have a huge manifestation again of that status quo bias, where if we stop and think about this, all the indicators should be saying, I don't want to touch this. I don't want to be anywhere near this economy. I don't want anything to do with this business environment. But things are so strange, and we've had so little ability to really build good models or accurately predict something like this, that I don't think there's any way people have any confidence as to what the correct decision is. And people are probably afraid of making any kind of decision here.
Yeah, this is definitely the most unstable of situations and the most difficult to predict. And in some way, it's different because Yoon represents a more right-wing form of government. So in some ways, what's going on in this situation is counter to what we're seeing going on throughout much of the democratic world, this rightward shift in governing policy. And part of the reason Yoon was elected was because of significant dissatisfaction with the left-leaning Moon Jae-in government. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that too.
I don't think there's any if there.
So, this is a situation where not only is there short-term uncertainty, because again, we're dealing with an unprecedented situation in terms of the democratic norms in this country, but also the long-term path that this country is going to take. It's not clear to me at all that the opposition party is going to necessarily come back into power again. It's not even clear to me, given Yoon's support, which he still has some ample support, despite everything that's happened, it's not clear to me that he will not somehow come back to power again. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow. Clearly, that's not going to happen, but I also think there is the possibility, given the overall general dissatisfaction across the political spectrum, that really anything goes here. And I would say this is where ERM can also be incredibly valuable, given the significant political uncertainty. Subject matter experts who are interviewed really need to be judicious in terms of how they lay out different scenarios. And there's going to be quite a bit of uncertainty within the models themselves. There's going to be a lot of model uncertainty, and that's going to have to be factored into any future investment decision.
So let me put this question to you then. You spoke in our discussion around Germany of how there is opportunities. There's when you have this level of uncertainty and volatility in the political and economic environment, that there are opportunities to be had. We talked about how a good ERM model allows for this evaluation of upside risk. Are there points where there is sufficient uncertainty or the magnitude of downside is so substantial where the correct response really is to just walk away, to pivot away from a geography or a sector or a business interest? Or does that opportunity always sit there and is it always exploitable? And I know I'm positioning this in absolutes, which is a bit of a fallacy in and of itself, but I think the broader question stands.
No, it's a valid question. There's a saying that I like to follow with regards to going back to my actuarial training,
Hmm.
which is that when pricing a particular risk, you can't price for an avalanche. You can't price for a hurricane or any other massive disaster that just creates such huge losses. You could never charge for it and ever get adequately compensated for the risk you're taking. No one will pay it. So to answer your question, there is a time when the underlying volatility or the underlying uncertainty is so huge and there is relatively little confidence in the underlying assessment of possibilities that you're probably better off just sitting on the sidelines, at least for some time, until some of that uncertainty is removed.
Yeah, that's kind of what I suspect. It seems as though there really are some circumstances that are just, there is so much if and what if around them that it's almost impossible to put yourself or your organization in a good position. Now, this is all well and good for international interests, but what if you're a Korean company and you're kind of stuck with your geography? How do you then deal with that? What are we seeing in the market now?
Well, that's a great question, John. The Korean companies are basically validating what you just said. Some of the large Korean companies, they are moving more of their resources, more of their strategic plans to markets outside of Korea, and even moving some of their operations beyond the walls of Korea. And so, for example, Samsung is continuing and, in fact, accelerating its global expansion, particularly in the semiconductor sector. In fact, Samsung just announced a new $14.4 billion chip research and development center and plans to launch a new memory chip in late 2025 in order to strengthen its position in the AI infrastructure market. So that's just one example. There are other examples. Hyundai is also moving, particularly its EV manufacturing, beyond the Korean peninsula. So again, they're saying with their actions that there are more attractive opportunities outside of Korea than within right now, given the current circumstances. And again, that could change in 3 to 6 months, depending on how this whole situation plays out.
And I think everybody in Korea is hoping that it plays out that way. I doubt that anybody on the ground is happy with this level of not knowing what tomorrow is going to look like in any way.
Yeah, I agree.
So, a kind of broad meta question for integrating all of these topics we've discussed, all these different countries we've discussed today. We've seen this significant cluster of regime changes in multiple countries in a very short span of time. And we did have, as we mentioned, the one scheduled election, but we had three that were not seen coming in any way. I'm not sure this amounts to a genuine data point or if this is just noise. This is normal deviation within the background. Nevertheless, it seems as though it's noteworthy. And so the question I would pose to you is, given this, given what we're seeing, if this is genuinely something that's becoming more common, given global economy, global political factors, populist movements around the world. Do organizational risk models need an updated, let's call it regime change line item?
That's a great question. I would suggest that there needs to be included in the ERM program regular consultations with folks who have ears on the ground to not only domestic politics, but also international politics, particularly if we're talking about a multinational company. I would suggest you still want to know what's going on outside of the borders of where your markets are, because if there's regime change or some other type of geopolitical situation or uncertainty going on, it could affect the markets that you're in, even secondarily in some meaningful way.
Oh, yeah.
And
I mean,
certainly,
there's almost
yeah.
no industries are completely insulated geographically or nationally in any way anymore.
Yeah, and we've seen that certainly with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We've seen that with the Middle East conflict. All these things have effects that have a primary effect, and then there are also some secondary and tertiary downstream effects that are often more far-reaching, particularly with regards to supply chains, which now any major company has supply chains that are global and involve players from a number of different geographic regions.
You sort of hit on one of the fundamental challenges in most applied behavioral science, which is making first order predictions is very easy. Making second and third order predictions is extremely difficult. And if you can do that, you are very well positioned to ply your trade in the applied behavior space. And I think in the risk space as well, because, I mean, as we've discussed, these really are just permutations of each other.
Just a couple of final points, and I'm going to be a little bit repetitive because I do believe it's important. And in my experience, being a co-CRO of a Fortune 300 company, that it's very, very important to have ears on the ground and to be in touch with what's going on with regards to geopolitical situations. These things not only impact your business, but also impact those of your competitors, your vendors, and other important stakeholders, and ultimately impact how capital flows move around the world. So the best thing that I think you can take from this podcast is to make sure that those factors are being brought into the risk analysis and that you have individuals included who are finely tuned to the situations in local and national and international governments.
Behavior and Risk is brought to you by Capita Solutions. Behavior and Risk staff includes our research team, Sherry Xu and Jin Zhang, and our editing team, Qingying Gao and Athena Liu. Theme music by Crypt of Insomnia. The opinions presented here are solely those of John Burkhart and Rich Loria and do not represent those of Columbia University, Capita Solutions, or any other organization. We thank you for taking a chance on us today.